Hello again. This video is part 2 of chapter 1 of our textbook. And in video 1, we covered the majority of these questions. We talked about what is biology, the characteristics that all living things share, how we classify living organisms, and how they're organized into that hierarchy from biosphere all the way down to the individual atoms that make up our cells. But one of the most common questions that people have about science, and any field of science in particular, is that how do we know the things that we know? So the second part of this video is going to focus on the use of the scientific method and how the scientific method is used to come to the conclusions, how do we know what we know? And the scientific method is not a step-by-step set of instructions on how to design or conduct your experiment. It's more of a logical framework and an exercise in logic on how to analyze the information that you've collected and to reach the conclusions, the things that we know. So I'm going to share with you in this video the steps included in the scientific method. And then in our lab for this week, you are going to get a chance to develop and design your own experiment that meets all of the requirements of the scientific method to give you some practice in what happens in a lab and how scientists go about trying to figure out the answers to the hard questions that we ask. The scientific method always begins with making an observation. Making an observation. We always, or not we always, but generally we kind of skip that step when we're thinking about it and we think we go straight to forming a hypothesis. But before we even get to the hypothesis, someone, somewhere, had to have made an observation that led them to ask a question. Why? How does this happen? And then we can get to that all-important hypothesis that we develop. So the first step in the scientific method in any field of science is really making an observation. So I'm going to walk you through a kind of silly everyday example, but just to kind of show you how this works. So if your observation is, my toaster won't toast. That's a general observation. My bread is not getting hot. I'm not going to be able to have toast this morning. What's the logical question that you might ask after making that observation? Hopefully you said, why won't my toaster toast? So now we have made an observation, my toaster doesn't work, and we've asked a question. Why won't my toaster toast? Why doesn't this thing work? And now we've arrived at the part that people get really excited about, developing the hypothesis. And a hypothesis is a testable, very important word right there, a testable explanation for a specific set of observations. And then your hypothesis serves as the basis for the experiment that you will go on to develop. So the really, really important thing about your hypothesis is that you have to be able to test it. If you can't test it, then you can't use the scientific method to determine if your hypothesis is supported or not supported by the data that you collect. So if we're asking the question, why won't my toaster toast? What are some testable explanations, some testable hypotheses that we could generate to answer that question? Hopefully you're working through some of those in your head. One example of a testable hypothesis would be maybe that the outlet is bad. Perhaps there's nothing wrong with my toaster at all, and I'm going to test my outlet. This is testable by getting another electronic device that I know functions. So say I grab my box fan, and I know that my box fan works because I plugged it into another outlet and it has been functioning. So I take my box fan, I unplug my toaster and I plug my box fan into the wall. And my box fan turns on. So I've conducted the experiment, the testing of the box fan. And my original hypothesis was that my outlet was bad. But now I have to reject that hypothesis because my box fan works in that same outlet. So I know definitively that the outlet is not the problem here. So I have to reject that hypothesis. And this is an example of the kind of cyclical nature of the scientific method, because that hypothesis was not supported by my data. My outlet worked, so I'm going to reject that hypothesis, and I'm going to go back to the drawing board and form a new hypothesis, because I still haven't answered the question, why won't my toaster work? So the scientific method is really not a one and done, that's not my answer, so I'm going to give up kind of scenario. If my hypothesis is rejected, if my data does not support my original hypothesis, then I'm going to go back and I'm going to make a new one, because as a scientist, I'm very interested in answering that original question, and I'm not going to give up. So perhaps there is something wrong with my heating coil. So I'm going to conduct the experiment, or if my hypothesis is my heating coil is bad, my experiment will simply be replace it with a new one that I know is working. And my heating coil now heats up after I plug it in, and my toast toasts. So now that hypothesis can be accepted because my toaster works now. So the answer to why won't my toaster toast, that original question that we asked, was that my heating coil was bad. And I was able to determine that because I went through a series of hypotheses, rejected the ones that were not the answer, and continued to work through until I collected data that supported my hypothesis, and I was able to accept that as the answer to that question. This is obviously a very simplified version or example of the scientific method. And in real life, when you're trying to answer big questions like how does our digestive system work? How are we able to absorb nutrients through our tissues? The experiments become a lot more complicated, but the steps are exactly the same. We're making an observation that we're taking in food through our digestive system. We're asking a question, how is that converted to energy? And through a series of many, many hypotheses and many, many experiments, both failed and accepted, we know the answers to those now. And those are some of the questions that we are going to be able to answer this semester through our study of those human body systems. But I think it's really important to start here because this is the process by which we know all of the things that we do know. So your lab for this week, you're going to get a chance to develop and design your own experiment. And you're going to conduct an experiment that I've laid out for you using some common household items. So the lab for this week is heavily focused on understanding the scientific method. As you are conducting that lab, you want to be really mindful that you can identify the following elements of any experiment. You want to be able to identify the control group, the experimental group, your independent variable, and your dependent variable. If all of those terms are new to you, then the lab this week will be really exciting. And I encourage you, after you've read the directions for that lab, to contact me via email or set up a Zoom appointment. And if you want to go through, after you've read the directions, if you have any specific questions about what you're supposed to be doing and what you're supposed to be getting out of it, I would love to talk to you directly about that. So please don't forget that that's always an option through any of the assignments and any of the lectures in our summer course.